empezar, por favor. Nos falta Alicia acá y a Ibrahim, por favor. Ibrahim no lo conozco. ¿Quién? Ibrahim algo, no lo conozco.
Sí. So Nicole is going to pass on the control.
Tienes que apretar.
Hello? Shall we start? Please take a seat and let's start. It's the last panel.
Nos falta Alicia.
Okay, so let's kick off. So good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure and honor to be here at FIX discussing so many green finance related topics in the context of development banks. My name is Tatiana Alves. I'm sector lead for green finance at IDB. And I would like to welcome you all to this side event, Pathways of Public Development Banks Towards Alignment to Paris Agreement. I'll kick off this discussion by saying that the public development banks have a key role to play to support decarbonization and climate resiliency globally, and public development banks also have an important role in the mobilization of public and private capital at scale towards fulfilling the objectives set forth by the Paris Agreement. Some public development banks have taken on a leadership role in directing their resources to more climate-related investments based on their development mandates. However, given the urgent need that the matter of climate change brought to our society for climate action, it is no longer enough to direct some investments to climate-related activities. We need to do more, which boils down to ensuring that at some point in a very near future, all financial flows are aligned to the Paris Agreement goals, and that by 2050, we achieve collectively net zero greenhouse gas emissions. For that matter, public development banks will come across some key questions that they will need to have answers for. For instance, what really means to be Paris aligned? What are the costs and benefits for banks towards becoming Paris aligned? What are possible methodologies to use for such alignment, and how to choose one that best convey to its own characteristics? What are also possible opportunities that open for banks in the sustainable finance space when they take on action? What are additional tools and capabilities needed to undertake these tasks? What is already available, and what else is needed? Do governments need to be involved to create frameworks for action? But before we begin this workshop, I wanted to highlight that public development banks have a leadership that is a given, and also the capacity to set standards that will resonate across the industry and into the private sector players as well. At the same time, they will create a pathway for increasing existing portfolios and rechanneling investments into climate mitigation and resiliency-related activities broadly. So these are some of the topics that we would like to discuss about in this workshop. I will kick off this discussion by turning to my panel colleagues, Nicole Pinco from CPI, to kick off her presentation, followed by Laurent Bidescombe's presentation from AFD, and I will then make a brief presentation about IDB's work on public development banks' readiness on Paris alignment. Thank you very much, and Nicole, over to you.
Thank you very much. If we could put the slides up, please. Thank you. Excellent. So, hello everyone. I'm Nicole Pinco from Climate Policy Initiative, and together with I4CE and supported by AFD, we've been evaluating the alignment approaches that can be used to reach the Paris alignment goals and how they relate to decarbonization. This report is still very much a work in progress, and we'd appreciate any thoughts or opportunities to discuss further with either the other panel members or the audience going forward. So for the first part of this exercise, we undertook a literature review and extensive interviews with a variety of public development banks and external experts, just to get a sense of the existing landscape of alignment approaches. And at the moment, it's not a huge surprise, but there is no single widely understood or adopted approach for climate alignment within financial institutions, both public and private. However, we did find that there are two main approaches used at this level, or used at a very high level, and each of them has a number of variations between how it can be implemented and sort of the methods and methodologies used. So the first of these is the net zero portfolio approach, and this considers an institution's investments portfolio with the aim of decreasing the aggregate portfolio emissions. This is most commonly used by the private sector at the moment, and you would know it from GFAN's reporting. The second is the Paris-aligned project approach, and that involves screening individual projects as they come in to assess their alignment against country pathways, including NDCs, or sectoral pathways if available. And this is the approach that's most commonly used currently by public development banks. And a lot of times these will be presented as in conflict with one another or as an either-or approach. But in reality, we've found that each comes with its own positive aspects, and that several public development banks are looking to take the best pieces of each approach to combine them into a more harmonized aspect, an approach going forward. So on the weaknesses and opportunities of each approach, for the net zero portfolio approach, a lot of the opportunities really largely relate to its ease of use, particularly in developed economies where there's a strong set of data for it to pull from. And it summarizes an aggregate institution level number that can be integrated with other bank reporting requirements and is easily comparable to other institutions. So it does create that institution by institution comparison that can be lacking otherwise. And in terms of its guidance for implementation, it can be quite granular at times. In particular, the Science-Based Targets Initiative and some of the GFAN's alliances in particular include really detailed guidance on how to measure and incorporate, say, a client's Scope 3 emissions. And there's an increased move towards using sectoral pathways, which can lead to more targeted engagement. On the weaknesses of this approach, though, you really find that the assumptions used to model the emissions pathways and kind of underpinning decisions are really not always accurate, not always comparable between banks, and really don't take into account what's going on in emerging markets and developing economies. So similarly, and as finance emissions can be separate from real economy emissions, you often find that banks have the opportunity, not to say they do, but they have the potential to divest from high-emitting assets, which then leaves, real economy emissions still in place. And as such, there's really no incentive to invest in projects that don't reduce emissions, but do have other social benefits. So you are seeing, within the private sector that perhaps there's more interest in renewable energy projects and adaptation as the most clear example. On the Paris, we have a similar set of trade-offs on the Paris alignment approach. And so as a positive, you do get this really project-by-project approach at the very outset of project implementation. So it does have a stronger connection to real economy emissions reductions. It also does allow for the inclusion of qualitative criteria. So this is where you are able to easily include country needs, country NDCs, as well as transition needs, adaptation, and resilience spending. And so along the downsides of this approach, though, you have the fact that it can be implemented in just a huge number of ways. And our interviews really highlighted that some banks have, a strong quantitative process with validation in place, and others find the implementation to be more subjective, particularly in terms of how the different pathways are viewed and how NDCs are viewed. So, it is also a challenge to evaluate large or cross-sectoral projects, or even a high volume of rather simple projects, just because it is coming in on a project-by-project basis. There's also the issue that alignment isn't applied to existing investments, although I know some banks are looking at ways to adjust that now. It's only looking forward. So much like the net zero approach, there are also difficulties in applying it to emerging markets and developing economies that may not have a long-term strategy as well. So when it comes to applying both of these strategies, they do have some shared challenges in terms of their implementation. I think this is kind of the crux of many of the conversations that we've been having here at Finance in Common, and the challenges in moving climate finance from the global north to the global south. So a lack of long-term 1.5C pathways in developing economies, particularly how it approaches on a sector-by-sector basis, really does influence and impact the available financing in terms of how it relates to these approaches. A Paris alignment approach is looking to compare it to that trajectory. A net zero approach, doesn't have the data that's necessary to bring it into its portfolio properly. And then secondly, there's no real clear, widely used impact measurements. I know this is something that the different research teams are working furiously on, but in terms of measuring the impact of actual decarbonization from these two approaches, it's still extremely nascent, and we're actually working on this as part 2 of this approach to kind of gather more information about how the different measurements and impacts of these lead to decarbonization in the real economy. But particularly, these are all very data intensive at the moment right now already, even with just ex ante impacts. So the idea of applying sort of ex post impacts is really a next step that's beyond most public development banks. And I also want to add one third point that's not on the slide right now, but has really been highlighted at Finance in Common today and yesterday, which is the need to have a supportive government, public development bank governance and leadership and board in terms of developing and aligning a Paris alignment approach. If the leadership, if the board is not supportive of that, it creates just an extra hurdle that really has long-lasting impacts down the line. And so just lastly, I wanted to highlight a handful of comments that we found from our interviews and steering committee that we found were particularly interesting and kind of a little bit different than what we expected. So the first is that, not perhaps different than what we expected, but how it's actually implemented. Either the net zero approach or the Paris aligned project approach, how it's implemented at an institution level has a huge impact on what is actually occurring in terms of Paris alignment, what the impacts are, what the potential decarbonization is. Even just the pathways and scenarios used can really differ by different institutions. The second one, which we've definitely had some pushback on and might be slightly controversial, which is that client engagement on decarbonization is critical regardless of whether you're taking a net zero portfolio or a Paris-aligned project approach. Even within public development banks with a Paris-aligned project approach, there's been some really successful engagements on requiring clients to have transition plans. There's also a few banks that are really exploring ways to work with long-standing clients that may have high-emitting assets on ways to decarbonize their own strategies and their own operations. And thirdly, which is it's really critical for financial institutions to know and measure their financed emissions. Even if you take a Paris alignment approach, having that number, being able to quantify it in some method, even if it's only an internal number, can be hugely helpful in just keeping track of what different investments are and what their impacts are. And then lastly, and this isn't really controversial at all, which is to better understand the number of, to expand the number of public development banks that are able to take on these alignment approaches. We really need to understand how these approaches and their various methodologies really apply quantitative metrics to, and how they impact the developing economies at a granular level. So when we look at trajectories that are being used, what are they? What's the aspects of those trajectories? What do you do if there's no trajectory? What's the action plan there? So really trying to understand, what is next in terms of what the impacts are in terms of financing for developing economies and how those are used. And in particular, as we kind of take on our second round of interviews for this project, we're really looking to speak with public development banks to examine what opportunities and constraints they're perceiving in terms of the project approach, whether that's their preferred approach, whether they use a taxonomy, what their experience is with exclusionary lists, if they use any GHG indicators, and if so, which ones, how are they applicable, and do they find them useful? And, in particular, do you have an absolute emissions that you're collecting? Are you collecting relative emissions? Really trying to figure out how both of these approaches relate to real-world economy decarbonization so that we can start to pick and choose the most effective methods going forward. So with that, I'm happy to hand it over to Tatiana. Like I said, this is a work in progress. We'd be very happy to hear from any of you and hear any of your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Passing then over now to Laurent. Please, Laurent, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this this report. So it's an interim report, and it was already really interesting. Maybe just a bit of a background on why at AFD we decided to launch this study with our partner from the IDFC club and with I4CE and CPI. And to give a little bit of perspective on our own experience actually at AFD. And I'm going to jump on the additional remark you put about leadership and board approval. It made me think about our own history, and believe it or not, in 2016 some of us were discussing about closing our climate division because we already had a system of GHG emissions appraisal, very efficient, project by project, and we said, okay, now we have some specific targets. Everyone in the bank knows how to deal with this. It's okay, we don't need this. It was just a little team of 4 or 5 people. And then our CEO, who took office in 2016, he said, I think we're missing something, guys. We just signed something in Paris a few months back. We have to go much further. So your GHG system, it's nice, it's needed, but we have to make the step forward. And that's when we decided to have this Paris alignment strategy in 2017. So it was about changing our perspective on the way we did business. So indeed, leadership is key when we take such decision. Actually, the story behind that was that as a PDB, we felt that we had to go beyond this just project evaluation, and we had to have a more global view, an SDG global view, and to go further beyond the quantitative approach and get into something more dynamic, built on the path that countries have decided for themselves, sometimes with our support. You said that we need, of course, clear NDC, data supported and long-term strategy attached to that. Now, on the other side, we also, on top of our own alignment to the Paris Agreement, we've been working hand in hand with some of our partners to support them in their trajectory towards the alignment themselves. So we have mobilized different tools to support the alignment of our clients. At the national level, we've helped the governments with technical assistance to support the elaboration of their own long-term strategies. And also, of course, with our clients and partners, whether public banks and even regulators in some countries also, central banks, how to better integrate climate risk and climate investment strategies and frameworks in the way they do business, and also with public companies in power utilities, for instance, which are key, of course, in the energy transition. And what we've seen is that, of course, when we try to share our experience and help our clients work in this Paris alignment strategy, it comes with its hurdle, clearly. We're facing many complex questions, notably on how to analyze alignment of our clients, since, as you pointed out, it's a very qualitative process. And of course, this qualitative assessment of both the country context and of the project itself is very subjective. And that's why, of course, we developed sectoral guidelines, and then we also help clients build their own taxonomies and so on. But and you could argue that for countries where the NDCs are not ambitious enough, one could question, of course, the other sources that could be used and their compliance with a 1.5 or 2 degree trajectory. And of course, another hurdle that we've seen, the qualitative assessment that is attached with the Paris alignment strategy is very HR intensive. And of course, it's going to be a concrete barrier for the smallest PDBs among us. So sometimes people prefer to do the net zero approach. It seems in the beginning a bit easier. But on the other side, as you mentioned, it can prevent our institutions to finance some investments that are emissive, certainly, but that they are necessary either to fulfill social duties or in terms of the long-term strategy of of the countries. So that's what we've seen. That's what we wanted you to provide us some insight, and I think that you've set up quite very clearly the hurdles of both approach, opportunity and weaknesses, and I really look forward to the discussion with our partners on the other side of the table. Even I don't think it's a good way of putting things. And please be very blunt about your feelings about that and on your own experiences. It's key for all of us in order to better the way we do business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loham. So I'm now going to present a little bit of the work that IDB has been doing with some of the banks in the region. And then after the presentation, I'm going to pass over to Jesus Gutierrez from Alide so that he will moderate the panel with some of our dear clients here. Thank you very much. Let me see if this is working.
Yes.
Is it working? What's the magic, Nicole?
That's for you.
Okay, so let me start, and hopefully I'll get some help here. Okay, so wanted to provide you with some context about the IDB advisory program to the public development banks in the region towards Paris alignment. But I think that before we get into that, it's just, interesting to bring up what does actually Paris alignment mean, right? So broadly speaking, we're talking about economies working towards actions that mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to and build the resiliency needed towards the effects of climate change in the region. To do that, we need to align capital flows on that direction, working towards actions that deliver on the previous two. And that's really where we start the work with our clients in the region. So what it means for Paris alignment for public development banks. It really means more than climate finance. It's more than that. It's aligning to the Paris Agreement goals is a systematic transformational process that we have to go through with our clients. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'll say adelante to switch the slides. Okay. All right. So, yeah. Okay, so basically it's a transformational process in which we look into mitigation activities, adaptation activities, and then from there we actually direct capital flows to basically support mitigation and then adaptation. Adelante. Adelante, please. Okay. So taking that into account, this broad overview that I just mentioned, the Capital Markets and Finance Division at the IDB, where I'm part of, created a technical advisory program that is split into 4 pillars that are in this slide here. The first one is the green climate self-assessment that we use to identify the strengths and gaps and the level of ownership of the institution that we're working with regarding climate aspects in their business practices. The second pillar is the portfolio and environmental, social, and climate-related risks management. So in addition to the support that the IDB has been providing in developing environmental and social management systems, we're also providing support in the design of climate risk management systems, such as the heat maps that I'll talk a little bit later, and also provide support in the development of tools for the identification and management of transition risks. The third pillar that we see here in this slide is metrics and dissemination. And the fourth pillar is development of sustainable finance strategy. This is really a staggered phased approach and adapted to each national and institutional context so that we're able to work closely with our clients in the region. With this framework, in April, we launched the Working Group on Paris Alignment Initiative, GTAP in Spanish, and the IDB and ALIDI initiative. The objective of this working group, composed by 9 public development banks in 6 countries, is to create awareness about what does it mean for a public development bank to become Paris aligned, understand the tools that they have, and mentor them in this pathway. Next, please. So one of the tools that we have developed, as I mentioned before, is the self-assessment tool. We piloted this tool in 14 public development banks in the regions, and the 5 competencies are assessed: strategic management, risk management, development of products, financial planning, metrics, and dissemination. So we can see here in the aggregated pentagon of competences, the banks show more progress in strategic management and financial planning and are less advanced in risk management and metrics and dissemination. If we see these competencies, the level of maturity overall is 53.6%. This means that the institutions are in progress taking into account the categorization that we have. So there has been a lot of progress up to now working with our clients, but we still have a lot of interesting challenges to tackle, and that again requires action now. Next, please. So this following 3 slides, this one and +2, we can see some key findings of the 14 self-assessments that were made regarding each of these competencies. For instance, on strategic management criteria, we see that 86% of the board of directors made an explicit mandate to incorporate criteria associated with green finance and climate change into their business strategies. Also, 86% of the public development banks reflect this in its mission, vision, and corporate values. 67 expressed through public communication channels commitment with national climate goals. And finally, interestingly, a lower percentage of 57% of the board, climate change represents both financial and non-financial risks. Next, please. On risk management, 64% have an approved mechanism in place for the identification and management of environmental and social risks, and 36% of these entities processes they have already processes that incorporate climate risk, but only 14 are already assessing the resilience of their portfolio and defining the alignment of their credit placement policy on climate change. Another 14% have considered doing so in the next 12 months. So we have a pathway here to go. Next slide, please. On metrics and dissemination, interesting to note that 79% of self-assessments made confirm that public development banks conduct annual sustainability support reports, but only 7 calculate the carbon footprint of its portfolio and internal operations. Next, please. Okay, here we have a picture, a snapshot of this assessment in terms of climate tagging, the IDB model for climate tagging. So in addition to the self-assessment, we have the climate tagging IDB model. And here we were able to speak with 3 banks where $46 million they were able to identify in their portfolios as activities that are either climate mitigation or adaptation that they are financing, but only 23% of that amount was financed, actually composing 23% of their portfolio in terms of identifying projects that initially were not identified as climate-related projects. Next, please. Okay, here it's another snapshot. It's really looking into what were the activities that these banks identified, and initially they haven't, on terms of activities that really deliver on climate mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please. And finally, next slide. The heat maps. Adelante. So the heat maps is the third tool that we have developed where we look into the portfolios of the banks and we understand, what are the risks associated with their portfolio in terms of climate risks. So we have a number of features inside this tool where we're able to map how the risk distribution is at the portfolio level, also by sector, and also in terms of financial exposure. Adelante. So this is in a nutshell, the work that we have been doing, the IDB advisory program on Paris alignment, based on, the self-assessment tool, the climate tagging tool, and the heat maps. And we look forward to continue this work with our clients in the region. So now I'm handing over the panel to Jesus. Jesus, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tatiana, for the introduction. My name is Jesus Gutierrez. I'm representing ALIDE, which is the Latin American Association of Development Finance Institutions. I'll be moderating this high-level panel called Pathway of PDBs Toward Alignment to Paris Agreement. The objective of the panel is to discuss and raise awareness about why and how a PDB would align its business model toward Paris alignment and what does it mean. This will be an open conversation focused on the organization's endeavors of our different panelists. We have here with us in the panel, let me introduce first to Maria Jose Naranjo. She's Vice President of Corporate Strategy at Banco Dex, which is the development bank for business here in Colombia and host of this summit. Also is with us Mrs. Alicia Montalvo. Alicia is Climate Action and Positive Biodiversity Manager at CAF, the development bank for Latin America. We have also in the panel Mr. Mark Swelling. Mark is a chairman of Development Bank of South Africa, the DBSA. And finally, is with us Mr. Ibrahim Traore. Ibrahim, he's a Division Chief of Climate Change of the West African Development Bank, the BOAD. Let me start first with Alicia. Alicia is at CAF, the Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina. My question, Alicia, is for CAF, Paris alignment means to prioritize adaptation and climate resilience, as well as sustainable development and poverty eradication. Reaching mitigation goals must be part of a broader ambition and inclusion strategy. Which are the main challenges for CAF in the Paris Agreement alignment process? How do you foresee CAF support to its members' energy transition?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Voy a hablar en español, si quieren utilizar la traducción. Bueno, primero me parece muy interesante este panel, aunque es verdad que parece que estamos en una especie de jurado, ¿no? Los que tenemos que alinearnos y los que ya están alineados o algo así, pero realmente es muy interesante escuchar el planteamiento. CAF ha hecho la apuesta de ser el Banco Verde de América Latina, de tener el 40% de su financiación, de su inversión dedicada a temas verdes, y el alineamiento con el Acuerdo de París pues forma parte también de este esfuerzo. Hace justamente 2 meses hemos asumido el compromiso de alinearnos con el Acuerdo de París, adoptando una metodología propia en el año 2024 y empezando a implementarlo para todas las nuevas operaciones a partir del 2026. Creo que hay mucho que aprender de la experiencia del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, entre otros, todo el proceso que se ha hecho de AFD. Pero para nosotros lo más importante, efectivamente, como ha señalado Jesús, es tener un enfoque propio que se ajuste también, como así se prevé dentro del alineamiento, a las necesidades de la región y a las necesidades de la institución. Y lo que vemos es que el foco muchas veces se pone sobre todo en los temas de mitigación, que son muy importantes, lógicamente, pero también hay que fijarse mucho en los temas del riesgo climático, la adaptación y la erradicación de la pobreza, que al final son elementos clave del Acuerdo de París. Y creo que esto es especialmente relevante y por eso pues me gusta escuchar también a mis colegas. Precisamente cuando nosotros adoptamos el compromiso hace 2 meses, estábamos también con mi colega Ibrahim Traoré en Corea, en nuestro proceso de reacreditación con el Fondo Verde del Clima. Y bueno, vimos que realmente esto era un tema especialmente importante. Me gustaría decir que para nosotros es un reto, pero es una oportunidad también el estar alineados. Y algunas de las cuestiones que queremos señalar es, primero, tenemos que ser muy pragmáticos y desarrollar herramientas que no supongan que la carga administrativa que supone alinearnos con el Acuerdo de París sea mayor que realmente el beneficio que va a suponer en términos de identificar nuevas oportunidades, nuevas operaciones, trabajar de otra manera. Hay que hacer un cambio de paradigma, pero no hay que olvidar cuál es nuestro papel como bancos de desarrollo, que es ayudar a los países a cumplir sus compromisos en materia climática, pero sobre todo a tener un desarrollo sostenible y a erradicar la pobreza. Por lo tanto, no podemos trabajar de manera que el alineamiento sea una barrera, sino que sea una ayuda. Y creo que eso es muy importante también, que reflexionemos cómo podemos instrumentalizarlo, ¿no? Y no hay que olvidar que todos los países miembros de CAF se han adherido al Acuerdo de París. Por lo tanto, nosotros lo que tenemos que hacer es ser consistentes con el esfuerzo que ellos ya han hecho y a partir de ahí trabajar. ¿Cuál es nuestra preocupación? Pues que efectivamente hay que hacer un esfuerzo de tiempo, esto toma tiempo, se ha dicho, es importante el liderazgo que asuman los accionistas, eso lo habéis señalado y creo que a veces es un tema complicado porque aunque son los accionistas los que están adheridos al Acuerdo de París, son luego también los que deciden la prioridad de nuestra cartera y por tanto tenemos que trabajar con ellos. Hay que hacer un esfuerzo de capacitación importante y se tiene que dedicar recursos económicos y sobre todo un tema clave que es lo relacionado con la trazabilidad de la información. Sabemos que el proceso de alineamiento está sometido también al acceso a la información o la disponibilidad de la información y no hay que olvidar que esto en muchos casos pues también es complejo para los países, ¿no? Cuando estamos haciendo la evaluación del 100% de los proyectos necesitamos que esa información sea accesible, pero muchas veces no existen las herramientas necesarias. Se requiere también capacitar internamente al personal, tener bueno, pues, la capacidad de que el ciclo del proyecto se incorpore adecuadamente el tema del alineamiento. Y sobre todo creo que hay que pensar de otra forma como banco multilateral o como banco regional. Creo que tenemos que trabajar de manera cooperativa todas las instituciones para efectivamente estar alineados con el Acuerdo de París, pero tenemos también que pensar cuál es nuestra labor y cuáles son nuestras metas, ¿no? A lo mejor estamos siempre actuando de manera compitiendo unos con otros cuando en realidad nuestro objetivo no es solo colocar créditos, somos bancos, sino que tenemos también que ayudar al desarrollo, ¿no? Y en eso, pues el proceso de alineamiento con el Acuerdo de París nos tiene que ayudar también a hacer un cambio de paradigma. En tema de energía, el tema de la transición energética es un tema clave en el proceso de alineamiento con el Acuerdo de París, porque efectivamente en el caso de América Latina entendemos que la transición debe ajustarse pues, también a las necesidades de acceso a la energía a un precio razonable y por tanto pues eso también va a hacer que se tenga que hacer un esfuerzo especial para que los sectores, sobre todo de combustibles fósiles, pues puedan ser adecuadamente incorporados en nuestra agenda. En definitiva, estamos muy comprometidos con el proceso, pero creemos que los retos son muy importantes y nos preocupa que, bueno, pues que al final, digamos, el qué y el cómo no vayan perfectamente alineados, ¿no? No queremos construir metodologías que no estén adaptadas a nuestras necesidades y que no tomen en consideración también las necesidades de los países, que al final pues, es nuestro objetivo. Por tanto, muy contentos de habernos adherido, muy contentos de tener un plazo que nos hemos marcado, pero también con una cierta preocupación de que efectivamente se pueda hacer de una manera que resulte consistente con los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alicia. I want to move forward to Africa with Mr. Ibrahim Traore. He's from the West African Development Bank. Ibrahim, the West African Development Bank is an international institution whose purpose is to promote the balanced development of its members' countries and foster economic integration within the West Africa. The priorities in West African countries vary from one country to another, even though there are some common challenges. Among them are poverty, inequality, food insecurity, healthcare and disease, infrastructure deficit, etc. But at the same time, these countries are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We can say that this region of the world contribute very little to greenhouse emissions, but disproportionately suffer the consequences of global warming. My question is, how can the international community ask a development bank, like the West African Development Bank, for a strategy to align itself with the Paris Agreement when it has so many development finance priorities? How does the bank balance these two issues?
Thank you. I'm Ibrahim Traore from West African Bank, and thank you for your question. The development priorities and the alignment of the strategic plan with Paris Agreement on climate change are not totally news to us in several ways. The international community really does not require further alignment than what is currently transpiring from our strategy. Beginning 2009, BWAD became an UNFCCC observer. In that regard, hosted the Regional Collaboration Center within its wall, the first regional collaboration center. BWAD is also one of a rare institutions to be accredited to the three main climate funds under UNFCCC, mainly the GEF, GCF, and Adaptation Fund. On the notion of financing development and the fight against climate change, you have to know that BWAD shareholders have all ratified the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, on one hand with an embodiment of the SDGs 2030 agenda on the others. The drafting of the current 2021-2025 Joliba strategic plan are therefore being guided by Paris Agreement on Climate Change and the implementation of the 17 SDGs and the 169 targets. Taking into account the fight against climate change, one can say that the third axis of our Joliba strategic plan has been dedicated to the strengthening climate resilience and the fight against climate change, with the view of greening 25% of the bank financial engagement between 2021 and 2025. Furthermore, BWAD has enacted a 2021-2025 environment and climate finance strategy, which mainly focuses on increasing investment and mainstreaming climate with the bank's operation. In 2023, BWAD board has also enacted a climate policy which in terms of sustainable development focuses also on just transition. This is clearly show the intrinsic link BWD has with the fight against climate change. So for us, there are not a dichotomy between climate change and development for our country. It's the same for us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to stay in Africa, and I would ask Markin Suelim, who is chairman of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Mark, the Development Bank of Southern Africa is one of the leading African development finance institutions with a focus on social inclusion, sustainability. It has also advances such as access to green funding and international climate funds to finance projects in specific sectors such as energy, IT, transport, water, and sanitation. My question is, to achieve these goals, the bank had to face many barriers and challenges. The transition is complex for any development bank. Can you share with us the main challenge the bank had to face, as well as the perspective about what else you will need in the near future? Because it is not only a matter of having financial resources or green financing resources. It's also of having bankable projects. It's also the capacities of the institution in a region that is affected by instability sometimes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for the presentation. My day job is as a university professor, so I kind of combine operational experience from a board perspective and my academic understanding. You're right, South Africa is going through a very, very intense, noisy, conflictual, contradictory energy transition. And the Development Bank is right in the middle of that. So 20% of our book is in the state-owned energy utility, which is has 15 coal-fired power stations. The average age is 41 years, so it's an old fleet, and most of it has to get shut down within the next decade and a half. And no one is going to give South Africa funding to build new coal-fired power stations. And so we have to build renewables at a very rapid rate. We have to build at least 5 gigawatts of new renewable capacity per annum for the next 20, 30 years. If we are going to slowly decommission on the one hand and transition our economy to a renewables-based economy, we don't actually have an option. But obviously, there are from a technical point of view, we don't have an option. But in the real world, technical realities are not exactly what determines actual choices. And there's a lot of vested interests in the old system. And we are right in the middle. So the 20% of our book is also in renewables. And the biggest growth sector in terms of our lending program is renewables. And although there is a lack of a political settlement at government level on exactly what our energy future is, a whole bunch of decisions have been made in the last 2 years that means that there is 30 gigawatts of renewables in the pipeline that's approved. And a lot of those developers are coming to the DBSA for funding. So we are getting drawn into funding the energy transition on a very, very large scale. We also set up the renewable energy program back in 2010, 2011, when we provided the funding to set up the procurement office to manage the transition. And all the staff in that office, which is located in the Department of Energy, still are our employees. So the biggest challenge that we face now going forward is that despite opposition to renewables, it's happening, it's rolling out, and there is a massive bottom-up investment by households and businesses in renewables, which is also supported by the commercial banks. So we're in this process of transformation, but one of the biggest blockages is the grid. So the transmission grid, as you know, the lead time on transmission grid expansion is much longer than building renewables. So like in many parts of the world, there's a contradiction. And so the big focus now for DBSA is actually how to facilitate the concessioning out of sections of the grid, to put together public-private partnerships where we would take the highest risk and put in the lowest cost capital in order to draw in private sector co-investments. There's plenty of liquidity in the South African economy. We don't need any international aid. We have more than enough money to fund our transition. What is problematic is the institutional configurations to make sure we get the blended finance solutions. And I'm very much personally involved with the Minister of Electricity and his team in putting together the policy frameworks, the regulatory framework that would then enable the DBSA to become the lead arranger of what will be the small hinge which will unlock, will allow the big door to flow. I mean, without dealing with the blockage that is the transmission grid, we won't be able to do anything else. So that's hopefully a description in a very short space of time of an extremely complex situation.
Yes, excellent. We can say that alignment to Paris Agreement is not the same for one bank than for another bank. The contexts are very different. The instruments are very different. The advances that one bank has, another has not the same advance. Okay, and related to this, I want to ask, I think, Maria Jose. I will ask you in Spanish. Okay, it's okay. Okay. ¿Qué significa para Bancoldex el tema de la alineación a París? Pero sobre todo, y más que otra cosa, lo que quisiéramos saber es sobre esta alineación que tiene mucho que ver con cumplimiento de metas de cambio climático, etcétera. El banco opera en una economía, bueno, la economía de Colombia tiene una huella de carbono, más bien los sectores predominantes en la economía de Colombia son sectores que tienen mucha huella de carbono, como la minería, como el gas, como el petróleo y sobre todo el tema de la agricultura. ¿Cómo combinas estas dos cosas? ¿Cuál es el balance? ¿Cuál es la estrategia que Bancoldex ha estado siguiendo para poder balancear, digamos, estos dos temas que son relevantes al mismo tiempo?
Gracias, Jesús. Primero, Laurent, Nicole y Tatiana, mil gracias por la información, muy útil para nosotros que estamos transitando esto que estaba describiendo Jesús. Última pregunta del día, yo no se me van a dormir y voy a ser súper ágil. Los voy a dejar simplemente con 3 titulares y voy a partir la respuesta en 2. Porque me preguntaste que cuáles eran las implicaciones para Bancoldex de estar alineado con este acuerdo, y luego abordaré el tema de los sectores, que es bien importante para una economía que depende y que tiene unas regiones en Colombia donde específicamente la población se emplea con esos sectores que son tradicionalmente productores y generadores de valor. Entonces, en temas de implicaciones, pues yo creo que hay 3 para Bancoldex, y me parece estar oyendo a Alicia y Nicole, tú mencionaste en tu estudio varias cosas de lo que nos está pasando a nosotros en este momento. Lo primero, Jesús, es necesitamos tener una estrategia climática. Esa es la primera implicación, y una estrategia climática necesita del compromiso de la Junta Directiva, con roles y responsabilidades claros desde la Junta Directiva pasando por toda la organización y que cada vez en el ADN de nosotros como funcionarios de las entidades entendamos lo que implica eso en cada peso que desembolsamos y el impacto que genera eso, nuestra cartera y los riesgos climáticos que implica. Eso no es de un día para otro y eso hay que aprenderlo, entenderlo. Y les debo confesar una cosa, estar acá y ser host de este evento es una responsabilidad gigantesca. Y a mí me da mucho orgullo saber que junto a mí hay casi que 40 funcionarios de Bancoldex que vinieron y que están poco a poco, como todos nosotros, entendiendo que esto es una realidad y que Bancoldex, al igual que CAF y al igual que BOAD, tiene unas obligaciones para poder, ¿no?, cumplir todos estos objetivos. Entonces, esa, Jesús, es la primera implicación y, como les digo, ser host de este escenario yo creo que nos abre los ojos y realmente es una responsabilidad gigantesca y es que no hay opción, hay que cumplir. Y eso entonces me lleva a la segunda implicación, que es esto tiene que ir incluido dentro de nuestros SARAs, que es el Sistema de Administración de Riesgos Ambientales y Sociales, como un capítulo donde también vamos a entender que el assessment de los créditos va a tener un componente cada vez más climático y cada vez más distinto. Y sin duda, nuevamente, esto no pasa de la noche a la mañana, así que nosotros también tenemos que aprender y entender. Y ahí es donde la cooperación internacional de entidades como CAF, por ejemplo, son absolutamente neurálgicas porque es una asistencia técnica que le va a venir muy bien al banco o pues BID con los estudios que estamos haciendo. Estaba mirando, Tatiana, en el caso de Bancoldex, el pentágono que tú mostrabas de los resultados y en nuestro caso estamos en una brecha larga de las métricas. Entonces eso hace que el banco tiene que tomar decisiones deliberadas de unos compromisos en métricas y ya lo sabemos y hacia allá tenemos que trabajar. Nuevamente, desde la Junta Directiva, bajando todos nosotros hasta entender cada funcionario cómo contribuye a ese cumplimiento. Entonces, segunda implicación. Tercera implicación, el portafolio de productos y servicios sí tiene que ser absolutamente alineado con estas necesidades que hay. Entonces, el banco diseña productos financieros y no financieros, y en los financieros hay un instrumento que resulta ser bien interesante y es aquellas líneas que tienen un componente de cooperación en aporte y nos ha funcionado en otros escenarios, pero yo creo que eso es un instrumento que resulta que hace fit muy bien con este propósito, es lo que nosotros llamamos líneas especiales que con este componente de componente financiero que cubre el diferencial de tasas, uno puede ponerle unos premios a los empresarios que cumplan las metas de descarbonización o que cumplan unas metas y conforme se va cumpliendo la meta, yo le voy reconociendo una reducción en la tasa de interés o le voy alargando el plazo. Entonces es un incentivo que va y viene y le sirve, es gana-gana, le sirve al empresario y le sirve a Bancoldex. Y ahí estamos contribuyendo con el sector empresarial. Entonces, eso es el 1, 2, 3 de las implicaciones para Bancoldex, junto con, claramente, una necesidad, y Nicole lo mencionaba en el estudio, es de la necesidad de información relevante para poder dar fe de que todo esto está pasando. Y eso solamente se consigue pidiéndole a las pymes, en nuestro caso, a quienes les prestamos una información técnica que probablemente ellas tampoco saben cómo hacer y hay que acompañar el proceso. Esa asistencia técnica nuevamente, entonces para nosotros como bancos para aprender, para los empresarios que hay que acompañarlos también en el proceso de aprender, porque de lo contrario, ¿qué evaluación de impacto vamos a poder hacer si no tenemos información de calidad? ¿No es cierto? Entonces eso por parte de las implicaciones en lo que a Bancoldex le concierne. Tú mencionabas el tema de los sectores sensibles y realmente duele porque son unos sectores que la banca en la multilateralidad, digamos, hay unas listas de exclusión que claramente pues, nosotros tenemos que respetar y así pues, lo hacemos. Y seguramente la banca comercial poco a poco se va a retirar por las implicaciones que tú mencionabas. Entonces, hay que ayudarle a esos sectores a prepararse porque eventualmente entonces ¿quién los va a ayudar y quién los va a atender? Nuevamente la asistencia técnica, el acompañamiento, no soltarlos de un tanganazo, sino poder acompañar poco a poco a que se preparen y que ellos también ayuden a un proceso de cambio de la economía. En Colombia hay sectores, hay regiones como La Guajira, por ejemplo, que depende altamente del carbón, y eso sí que es sensible. Y son poblaciones donde se genera empleo, donde hay unas familias muy específicas que dependen de esos sectores y nuevamente entonces hay que hacer esa transición cuidadosa entre que no los puedo soltar, hay que acompañarlos y entonces cómo es esa relación entre banca de desarrollo y banca comercial. Todos nos tenemos que preparar y acompañar a que ese proceso se dé de una forma muy prudente. En el caso puntual de Bancolex, nosotros atendemos 130.000 MIPYMES al año. Imagínense ustedes lo que es colectar información valiosa de ellos. Hay que acompañarlos porque no tienen la capacidad técnica hoy por hoy de darnos una ficha técnica de lo que va a pasar. Entonces tengo que ir acompañando para que el día de mañana Bancolex pueda decir con certeza qué impacto tuvo, cómo acompañó el proceso de descarbonización de los sectores y cómo es su riesgo climático de la cartera que colocó, con unas metas deliberadas, unas apuestas que hace junto con su junta directiva para que haya claridad en todos los niveles y unos roles y unos compromisos claros. La junta directiva de Bancolex estaba en este evento, está. Y para mí también es muy placentero saber que ellos también están alineándose y entendiendo que esto tiene unas implicaciones desde la junta directiva hasta cada uno de nosotros.
Quiero retomar un poquito esto que comentabas del tema de las ciertas zonas que hay en el país, donde se tiene que tomar en cuenta a las comunidades locales, la población indígena, la sociedad civil. Todo esto es clave para que los proyectos puedan implementarse de manera exitosa, ¿no? Instead of making some resume or some summary of panelists have said, I would prefer, I don't know, Tatiana, to open the floor to some questions of the audience. I think it is better, stimulate the participation of the audience. Anyone have any questions to our panelists? ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta para nuestros panelistas que quisiera hacer? Bueno, creo que como ya es la última sesión, yo creo que han de querer ir al evento social. ¿Quieres que haga un sumario?
Sí, Jesús, si quieres hacer un sumario, porque sí, tenemos 15 minutos. Podemos terminar ahora, podemos recoger unas preguntas o... Sí, por favor.
Sí. Hay una pregunta de aquel lado, por favor.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment, whoever would like to answer the question, about the fact that typically there are problems in terms of the alignment of sectoral policies, for example, in infrastructure, transportation, energy, not only with the Paris climate goals, but also with the SDGs, which is one of our big priorities of discussion here. In fact, there's been a lot of discussion about sort of mobilizing more funds for project finance, finding more bankable projects, crowding in or enticing the private sector. But it seems like the question of where do projects come from, and the fact that a lot of the projects that one sees, especially in infrastructure, are very problematic in terms of alignment with Paris goals, SDGs, respect for human rights, including in local communities like the people I'm with here. So how to deal with that in terms of working with SDGs to have a program that's where they can play a more productive role. And it seems like that's not only a question of the bank's own institutional culture, but also how it works with agencies, for example, in the areas of transportation and energy, to help support, to have better planning and incorporate, internalize those sorts of concerns in their own planning process, including analysis of alternatives. And that's a way, I think, to have much more robust projects for the banks to support, and to reduce their own risks as well, both social, environmental, financial, and reputational risks for the PDBs. So I think that speaks to the question of technical assistance for the that the PDBs can have vis-a-vis governments in terms of strengthening their own sectoral policies. That would be my question. Thank you.
Make a comment. A lot of our infrastructures are collapsing, and especially water, energy, roads, rail. We've gone through a period of what we call state capture, and we are now going through a period of reconstruction, in particular focused on our infrastructures. And you're absolutely right. The biggest problem with these large-scale infrastructure projects is the impact they have on communities, which quite often can be very negative. When it comes to energy, our energy policy combined the auction mechanism, which is a procurement way of procuring renewable energy, with developmental criteria, which made it compulsory for local communities where energy infrastructures were being built to have a share in the ownership of that infrastructure, and for a percentage of turnover to be spent in a compulsory way on local enterprise and local labor and local development projects. And so the procurement system, when it comes to renewable energy, has been widely recognized internationally as a good example of a way of dovetailing massive infrastructure investments with local community development. And a lot of the investments that we made as a development bank was in setting up the community trusts that were the ownership vehicles for the local share ownership of those infrastructures. The problem, in theory, it's a really good idea, but communities often lack the capacity to engage, and there's insufficient investment in the way in which the projects are packaged in building the institutional capacity of communities. So what we've decided is to start a completely new program, which is also very unique, which is what we call D-Lab. So what we do is, on a grant funding basis, we take a very substantial chunks of our surplus, and we set up platforms, institutional platforms in the poorest rural and urban areas, where we co-locate community structures, NGOs, entrepreneurial initiatives, traditional communities, or a whole range. We create a space for co-location and management support for the operation, and that is a massive investment in the capacity of communities to figure out their engagement with development in general, but infrastructure projects in particular. So we've got 9 of these development labs operating, and we would like to build, well, as a board, as a chair of the board, I tell the executive the goal is 100, and that would make a very massive impact in empowerment of communities.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think it's time. I'll give the floor to Tatiana to the final words, please.
Thank you, Jesus. I would like to thank the panelists for joining here today in this discussion, Paris Alignment for Public Development Banks. Would like to thank also the audience for sticking with us till almost 7. Wish we can continue this discussion with our clients in the region and exchange of knowledge with other regions as well. Thank you very much, Jesus, for moderating the panel.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.